Hello everyone. I'm Odon Lafontaine from France, from Paris, as you can notice from my thick accent. I hope it won't be a problem for your understanding. Feel free to ask questions if you don't understand me. I'm here today to present my work about the fabrication of the standard Islamic narrative. But I won't speak to you as a scholar or an academic, because I am not. Actually, before studying Islam, I was a strategy consultant. So I applied my strategy consultant mind to Islam. So it's all about solving problems, getting to understand the big picture, the key elements, and so on. So my skill is understanding and making others understand. And for this, I rely on the work of scholars, real scholars, who have the real expertise of the topic, especially early Islam history and so on. I've written a book about my findings, The Great Secret of Islam, which is available for free on my website as a PDF file. So feel free to download it. You will get much more details and the sources and so on, the details that you don't have here. So let's jump into it and start by asking us the right questions about Islam and its narrative. When one looks into Islam and wants to understand how it emerged, how it was created, how everything happened, one tends to ask questions based on the Islamic narrative. Questions such as, who was the real Muhammad? Because one assumes that Muhammad, the Muhammad that is portrayed in the Islamic narrative, is the creator of Islam. And so the questions come along, such as, was Muhammad a prophet? Was there an original Quran? Is the Quran a divine revelation? Did Muhammad preach the Quran? Was he born in Mecca? And so on. Did the Caliph change the Quran? But actually, none of these questions is relevant if you want to really know about Islam. It's a bit shocking what I just said, because of course any Muslim will get mad and will tell me I am a madman myself. But the real question behind all of this is, what is Islam? What actually happened? And how did Islam emerge and create its narrative? Because it's very difficult to understand Islam and its real history and its deep nature, its real spiritual nature, if you rely on the Islamic narrative. This has been already understood and proclaimed and written by scholars such as Patricia Krone, a Danish scholar who wrote, for example, in 2010, the principle of critical thinking and a scientific method about understanding history. She wrote it about the Quran, which is just a part of the making of Islam. We have to start by understanding the Quran on the basis of information supplied by the book itself, as opposed to that of later readers, and to understand this information in the light of developments known to have preceded its formation, rather than those engendered by the book itself. And we could apply this saying, this assertion, to the whole of early Islam history and say we have to start by understanding Islam history, not by its narrative, which is a secondary source, a late source, a much later source, but you have to understand Islam's history on the basis of information supplied by history itself, meaning what a history scholar should do: study contemporary sources, contemporary remains, archaeological remains, for example, and applying the historical critical method. as opposed to that of later sources, that being the Islamic narrative. And by doing so, we have uncovered, I would say the scholars, the specialists who work on early Islam history, we have uncovered early Islam's history. And especially here, I will present it to you, but I don't want to go into much detail, so as not to go into debates, so as not to engage, for example, against our friend Nell, who was presenting the different Muhammad in Judaism and Christianity, which one is the model for Muhammad and so on. Let's not go that deep, but let's try to understand the big picture. And we will see it's quite easy. Actually, what happened at the beginning of Islam, when Islam wasn't named Islam, there were 4 phases, 4 stages. At first, it was the beginning of the 7th century, and there was a context of an end of times. The people thought that the apocalypse was coming, and there were many reasons for this, mainly the war between the 2 great empires, Persia and Byzantium, and their collapse due to the war. Persia was conquered by Byzantium. Byzantium was exhausted by the conquest. And during this time, we saw that there was a sort of messianic frenzy. Because of this feeling of an end of times, people were waiting for the Messiah to come back. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah, their Messiah, who is not Jesus. And the Christians were waiting for Jesus to come back and to put an end to their misery, to put an end to the wars, to the devastations, to the sickness, and so on. They were waiting for the kingdom to come. And among them, we saw some Arab movement of armed prophetism, armed Arab prophetism with a Christian background and some with a Jewish Christian background, who were preaching the end of times and the coming of the Messiah. Among them, some had a recipe to hasten the coming of the Messiah and to trigger the end of times. It's very well known today because we have the same situation. In order to force the Messiah to come, you just have to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and the Messiah will come, Mashiach in Hebrew, and he will establish God's kingdom on earth, and everything will be okay. We will get rid of evil, of war, and so on. And this is what happens. We saw that in the second phase, starting from the defeat of Persia, so at the end of the 620s and the beginning of the 630s, we see Arab factions seizing power, a power that was left vacant by the 2 great empires, and particularly Jerusalem was taken in 638 by an old alliance of Jews and Arabs, and they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. So there was a 3rd temple in Jerusalem at the time, up until Abdul Malik's time, when he built something on the dome of on the Temple Mount, which could be the actual Dome of the Rock. I won't go much further about this, whether the Dome of the Rock of today is the one from Abdul Malik and so on, but we have to know that we have many independent testimonies, sources from the 7th century and after, telling us about the rebuilding of a 3rd temple in Jerusalem. So we know the meaning of such an event. It was made to trigger the end of times, to trigger the coming of the Messiah, and we know also that the Messiah did not come. And this helps us to understand what happened afterwards. We saw Arab leaders fighting among themselves over their claim to their own messianic power. So there were various contestants. If we look with a critical approach into the many stories of the Islamic tradition, we could see that there were some partisans of Ali, whether he is or is not an historical figure. Let's call them Halids. Their leaders claim to be the Messiah themselves. Ali, in the Shia traditions, claimed to be Jesus. He claims to be the Parousia, the second coming of Jesus. And so this was a very strong claim to a messianic power. When you pretend to be Jesus himself or the Messiah, you pretend to God, divine power. And there were others. There were the Umayyads. Umayyads were much more into military, and their claim to power was that they were the strongest. Therefore, God must have chosen them because they are the strongest. And so they also claimed messianic power. And in order to justify their claims, there are many claims, they invented religious legitimacy. We see this, for example, on the coins they minted. We see that some of the leaders started to justify their rule by writing "in the name of God," Bismillah, on the coins. Or they claim to be intermediaries between God and man by being both Abdullah, the servant of God, and Amir al-Muminun, commander of the faithful. When you claim to both title, it makes you an intermediary between God and man. And we saw also some people using the title Mahmad. Mahmad, we talked about it this morning. It's a very potent and strong messianic title. We saw also at the end of the 680s an Arab leader claiming to be God's envoy, Rasulullah. What I also came to realize is during this time, in the many Arab factions that were warring among each other, they had notes, religious notes. They were all stemming from Jewish Christian background, these people. The Arabs were Christians, and some had been Judaized. And during the first phase, the apocalypse phase, during the armed Arab prophets movement phase, there were prophets, or at least preachers, who preached them that the end of time was near, the Messiah would come, and so on. And there were notes that were taken during this phase. And the various Arab factions kept these notes that would ultimately become the Quran. And so the fight went on up until a leader strong enough to impose his rule emerged. So he is Abdul Malik, a very strong figure in human history. And he imposed his rule over almost every faction. So the war among them stopped or halted for a time. And instead of opposing his new legitimacy to theirs, he had the genius to take for him everything that the factions invented for their own legitimacy. So he took everything for him. He ruled in the name of God. He was himself Abdullah and Amir al-Muminun. He was the Rasulullah. He was sent by God. He was the Mahmad himself. He claimed messianic power. And especially, he claimed to be God's deputy on earth. This is what we saw on his coins. And so with him, God's kingdom sort of have come. Because the caliphate, as he founded it, is the place where God's rule is enforced by God's deputy. So, you see, there was this expectation for the end of times and for the Messiah to build his kingdom, his political kingdom on earth, and Abdul Malik made it. He was God's deputy, enforcing God's rule in his God-given empire, an empire that was strong enough to oppose Byzantium, and this was a sign that God was with him, that God had sent him. And it reinforced his power, and we can imagine that he was seen by his contemporaries as being really someone who was sent by God because he was the strongest. Things went a bit awry after him, because after him, his successors, his first successors, they took legitimacy for their own power as God's deputy on earth by claiming a connection with Abdul Malik. I am his son, I am his grandson, I am his nephew. But as time went by, it became more and more difficult to justify a divine power by a connection to Abdul Malik. And especially when the Abbasids took over in 750, it was impossible for them, the Abbasids, who opposed the Umayyads, so the dynasty of Abdul Malik, it was impossible for them to claim legitimacy for their divine rule by a connection with Abdul Malik and the Umayyads. They had slaughtered almost every Umayyad there was. So they needed another kind of legitimacy. They needed a direct divine legitimacy. They needed God to have spoken to one of them, giving them legitimacy to rule in its name. And this is how and why Islam, as we know it, in the form that we know, was invented. There was the invention of a prophet that would have been sent by God to give a revelation that made him the ruler of an Islamic state, and that gave legitimacy to his successors as being God's deputies on earth, and so on. And this is what the Abbasids invented. So you see how Islam emerged. So it's a very short synthesis, and you have the 4 phases in mind. So you have a few details, but not all of them. There is still debate among scholars, but this is of no interest here. Here we want to have a look at the invention, the fabrication of the Islamic narrative. So we want to look what happened after Abdul Malik, and mostly during the Abbasid period. Why did they invent the Islamic narrative? Like I told you, it's because they needed a direct divine legitimation to their own rule, to the caliphal rule. They needed legitimation because they wanted God to have shown to everyone that they were their caliphs, and that this legitimation was to legitimize the Arabs as God's new chosen people, and their ruler, so the caliph, as God's deputy on earth. They needed this new direct divine legitimation to be independent from the early Jewish and Christian context of the 7th century. So this is, they wanted this legitimation to be something new, not a biblical legitimation, because the waiting for the Messiah had failed and so on. And they wanted something that would fit their particular needs. They wanted something that did not rely on the figure of Abdul Malik. They wanted, and thus they required a new prophet and ruler sent by God that would provide the revelation whose succession would be the basis for the caliph's legitimacy. And because of this, they required the invention of a whole new narrative to explain the story of the prophet and ruler sent by God and so on. And so, when we have this in mind, we understand that the Islamic narrative that was built starting from this time is not the product of an historical inquiry, even a flawed inquiry. The scholars who wrote the Islamic narrative were not historians. They did not wrote it to write history. it was the opposite. It was a backward construction. It was constructed backwards to serve as a legitimation of the caliphate, so a legitimation of Islam. And by doing so, they built Islam. This is very, very important because if you look at Islam this way, if you look at the narrative this way, for example, the Sirah, the biography of the Prophet, you understand why there is so many flaws, inconsistencies, discrepancies. Whereas if you look at the other way, look at as if it were something historical, you won't understand why things are the way they are. This work has been done more than 100 years ago by a Belgian scholar, Henri Lamince. He wrote, for example, in an article in 1910, the article is called Quran and Tradition, How the Life of Muhammad Was Composed. It was written in French. He wrote at the time, so more than 100 years ago, that when Islamic tradition claims to present itself as an independent source of information, as a result of a vast investigation carried out by contemporaries and traditionists into the life of the Arab prophet, we may regard it as one of the greatest historical frauds ever recorded in literary history. So this is what the Islamic narrative is. And the way he understood it is quite easy. When you look at the Quran, you have many, many verses. Some of them are very difficult to understand. So you rely on the biography of the Prophet, and you see that the biography of the Prophet was not built to tell the story of the Prophet, but it was written to give an explanation to every verse of the Quran by presenting the actions of the Prophet. And when you look at the tradition on which the biography is supposedly built, you see that there are hundreds of stories, sometimes tens of different stories for the same verse with contradictions. The scholars don't agree with each other. And the only logical explanation is that they didn't know what the Quran was about, and they invented stories about Muhammad in order to explain what the Quran was about. So, starting from this, a process took place. A process that created or invented the Islamic narrative. It's easy to understand. There was a first layer, a foundational layer, as a starting point. So there had to be an Arab prophet sent by God who received a divine revelation that granted divine authority to the Arabs and their leader, leading to their rise to power. So this is the basis of the narrative. And starting from this, there was this logic of backward construction, starting from the conclusion. The conclusion is we need a direct divine legitimation for the divine power of the deputies of God on earth. So it started from the conclusion. It was initially to legitimize the caliph power, and it invented artificial premises to justify the conclusion, such as the story of the revelation. And the narrative developed this way, but it had to make do with significant constraints. It had to build upon everything that existed. It had to build upon the previous religious inventions of the 7th century. It has to take into account, for example, the Muhammad title. What does it mean? So it invented the idea that it is not about Muhammad, but Muhammad in Arabic. It had to take into account the Muhammad Rasulullah formula or assertions that were written, for example, on coins or on monuments. It has to take into account the God's deputy title. It had to fill in the gaps of this original story. It had to find a place of origin and a plausible background with a family and activities for the prophet. It had to create stories, many stories to explain and legitimize all this invention. It had to provide Islamic, or so-called Islamic explanation for every remnant of the history of the 7th century by reinterpreting, for example, the buildings like the Dome of the Rock and they had to invent an Islamic meaning for the building. For example, the building existed, and it was invented that the Dome of the Rock was built by Abdul Malik because of the night journey of the Prophet, because he went to Jerusalem flying with a flying donkey or horse from Mecca up to Jerusalem. And the Dome of the Rock was then built because it was the place where his flying horse took a rest before going to the sky. And it was the same with every remnant of this history, like the names of people, the names of places, the collective memories. The people remembered, collectively they remembered that during the 7th century they were waiting for Jesus to return. So it had to be incorporated within the narrative. It had to be explained in an Islamic fashion. And they had to make do with the external sources as well as they could. But they had no mastery over non-Muslim sources. And they used Abdul Malik's Quran as the basis for the revelation. This Quran was made by Abdul Malik and his minister Al-Hajjaj by taking over the various notes I told you about from the various Arab factions that Abdul Malik submitted. He took all of these notes, and out of them he made his own religious book that gave him supposedly precedence over Christians and Jews. And afterwards, this collection, the Quran, was used by the traditionists as the basis for the revelation. And so it had to be reinterpreted or retrofitted within an Islamic context. You had to invent stories. This is exactly what Henri Lamens discovered. Remember the historical fraud, because when you compare the Sirah and the Quran, you understand that there was a process of inventing stories with a very creative reinterpretation in order to give an Islamic meaning to every verse of the Quran. It also tells us that initially the Quran was not an Islamic text per se. It was a pre-Islamic or proto-Islamic text. And an Islamic meaning was forcefully put into it. This mechanism was very important. It is the core mechanism that shaped Islam and the fabrication of its narrative. And by doing so, you can imagine that thousands, millions maybe, of discrepancies, inconsistencies, oddnesses, and so on were created. And this, layer by layer, created the Islamic narrative. So let's go a bit deeper into the process. What does it mean to build upon the previous religious invention? For example, the prophet that was invented at the time its name had to be rendered as Muhammad in order to fit the inherited framework. There were coins, for example, with the Muhammad title. There were rock inscriptions, like you see it, with the Muhammad name. So the prophet was named Muhammad, and by doing so, it identified him with the distant figure of the 7th century that were associated with the Muhammad theme. For example, the armed prophets, the warlords, the precursor or impersonators of the Messiah. So, in order to create Muhammad as the Islamic prophet, the distant memories of these figures were used, but they were distorted and rewritten. So when you look at the Islamic narrative and the Islamic view over the Prophet of Islam, there is some historical truth in it. For example, he is named Muhammad because the Muhammad title was in use in the 7th century. But we cannot be certain, we can be certain that he was not named Muhammad at the time, for example. By doing so, when creating the history of the Prophet and of his successor, the first Caliph became the successors of the Prophet. And because they had to make do with the religious invention of the 7th century, the first caliph that were invented, so Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, but they were given the title Khalifat Rasulullah, Khalifat Muhammad, God's deputy, God's caliph, Muhammad's successors, and so on. This is how the story was invented. The supposedly tribe of Muhammad, the Quraysh, and their conquest became the driving force behind the early Islam narrative, and all the earlier mentions of Muhammad were retroactively Islamicide. Every time you see a Muhammad inscription, it becomes a Muhammad inscription. But you see it, for example, with this Christian coin with the Muhammad Mimha Mindal inscription. It doesn't fit. You cannot have the Muhammad as a prophet of Islam being written with a cross on a Christian coin. But nonetheless, the process kept on, and gaps were filled. Other gaps, for example, the creation of Mecca. By creating a prophet for Islam, they needed also to create a background, so a place of origin. But it's very difficult to create such a thing in an existing environment where there are witnesses and sources that say that there was no such thing as the prophet of Islam. So they needed a blank page to support a new history. A blank page that was free from Jewish and Christian influences of the Middle East. They needed an Arab blank page. And so it was the invention of a pagan background to the story of Muhammad. It goes along with the idea of a blank page. And building upon the previous invention of the Abrahamic significance of the site of Mecca, they decided to transfer the memories that existed from various figures of the first century armed prophet and so on, from their place of origin in Syria up to Mecca. And there were some geographical transfer of the Quraysh tribe setting from the northwestern Syria to the Hijaz. Here I have some interesting evidence for it that has been found by my mentor, Edouard Gallet. This is a map of Syria, of ancient Syria, that was made by a French archaeologist during the 1920s. And he found many places associated with the Quraysh tribe in Syria. You see this, you see the yellow arrow. Maybe you cannot read it, but the arrow points at a Khan el-Qurashiyeh. A Khan el-Qurashiyeh meaning, in Arabic, the halting site of the Quraysh, or the inn of the Quraysh. So it was a sort of caravanserai of the Quraysh. And you see, the onomastic science, studying the names of places, is something very, very sure. The names of the places don't change that much through history. And when you find traces like this of a Quraysh settlement here in Syria, it is evidence that in the 7th century the Quraysh tribe was there. There is no such thing in Saudi Arabia. Besides, this is the Khan el-Qurashiyeh. Besides, we have other locations in the vicinity of the Khan el-Qurashiyeh that also bear the name Quraysh. I have found 2 ancient maps of Syria during the 19th century, where you find a Ras Korash, so a Qurayshi cape or headland, just outside of the Khan el-Qurashiyeh. It means that the Qurayshi tribe, originally in the 7th century, was located there, and it was an ideal place for trade. international trade, caravan trade, whereas Mecca is not fit for trade. Another major constraint, like I told you, was the need to Islamicize the Quran. And it was the central process that shaped Islam and Islamic history. For example, every mention to Jerusalem and to Jerusalem temple in the Quran had to be Islamicized. The Quran is not about Mecca and the Kaaba. Originally, the Beit, the temple that is mentioned, is the temple of Jerusalem. The Hajj is the Hebrew Hag. It is a pilgrimage, a journey towards Jerusalem. Safa and Marwa, as you know, because you were there last year, and our good friend Robert Kerr explained it, are not hills in Mecca, but they are hills in Jerusalem. So everything referring to Mecca was reinterpreted as pointing to everything referring to Jerusalem was reinterpreted when writing the Islamic narrative as pointing to Mecca. And if need be, places names were invented to align with the text. For example, Mount Arafat, or to align with what existed. Let me just show you here what existed in the Syrian location of the Qurayshi tribe. For example, here in Syria, in the zone, in the area with a yellow 2, you can see a Abu Kaaba, interesting location. In the one zone near Hama, there is a Abu Qubais. Today, Abu Qubais is a place in Mecca. So you understand how things were invented. It's a bit like when immigrants and settlers came to America, they named, for example, the place where they came, New York, New Orleans, because they took with them the memories and the culture from Europe, where they came from. Islamicizing the Quran required to attribute its authorship to the Prophet as a revelation to Muhammad. And so interpolations were made in the Quran to designate Muhammad, because in the original folios that were edited into the Quran, there was no mention of Muhammad. Studies have been made that prove that all of the 4 mentions of Muhammad in the Quran and the one of Ahmad are interpolation. They were added at a later time. And it gives us strong evidence that the figure of the Prophet of Islam did not exist at the time of the proclamation that ultimately became written in the Quran, that it was a late invention. Islamicizing the Quran and attributing its authorship to Muhammad also implied that he had to reinterpret the mention of a Rasul, an apostle, in the text, and they were reinterpreted as referring to Muhammad, whereas the literal meaning of an apostle can point at Moses, for example, who was sent by God, or Jesus, or any other. But the meaning changed with this forceful Islamization. Other key expressions where the meanings of key expressions were changed. The Nazarenes that are mentioned in the Quran, Nasara, it means Nazarenes. They became Christians within the Islamic narrative. The Quran mentions a Quran. It talks about a Quran. Quran, literally, it means lectionary. And there are many mentions within the Quran of a lectionary. It is described, for example, as being an Arabic lectionary written in a clear language without contradiction. And so they invented the idea that the Quran auto-references itself. It talks about itself, but the meaning of the lectionary in the 7th century, it was not about the Quran, the Quran in Islam. It was about another book, a lectionary. The mushrikun associators, who initially pointed at Christians, became pagan in the Islamic narrative. The Beit, the temple, the Jerusalem temple, became the Kaaba, and everything was Islamicized within the Quran, and everything in the Quran, thanks to the invention of this narrative, has nowadays an Islamic meaning. And the original meaning has been hidden, covered by the meaning imposed by the Islamic narrative. I want to insist on the constraints that had a very significant impact on the fabrication of the narrative. So the narrative had to be built upon the previous religious invention. Gaps had to be filled. You had to Islamicize the remnants of actual history, such as the Dome of the Rock, Islamicize the Quran. And there came other constraints. The more you invent stories, the more complex the narrative becomes, the more you have to work to justify Islam, to establish its theology, its history, its Sharia law, and so on. Another constraint was that the narrative had also to justify the administration and the government of the caliphate. So stories were invented to justify the rule of the caliph. How, for example, he had to make people pay taxes, or how he had to treat Christians differently from Muslims or Jews. Narratives were created also to justify the caliph's behavior. Can the caliph, for example, marry his daughter-in-law, or maybe have sex with children? But also many stories were written to restore a sort of coherence and plausibility, to establish an internal logic within the whole of the narrative. And by doing so, thousands, millions, like I told you, of oddnesses, discrepancies, and consistencies were created. And every time a discrepancy or an inconsistency was created, and it had to be addressed. And so other stories had to be created to address, to address the cascade of contradiction and inconsistency, discrepancies that arose from this invention. And it forged a sort of process, a building process of the Islamic narrative that works this way. There is a layered construction. So the first layer was the invention of the Prophet and so on. And from a layer, you had another layer, and then another layer, and then another layer. And you had invention over invention. For example, the first one was creating Muhammad as a prophet, but at the time he was invented as a prophet, there was no stories describing how the revelation took place. Or at least the stories that existed were not the one we have now. In 746, for example, John of Damascus he writes in his writings about Islam that Muhammad is said to have received a revelation during his sleep, which means at the time the story is about the angel Gabriel giving him the revelation, or the revelation in the Hira cave did not exist yet. They hadn't been invented yet. When you do so, when you invent stories, you create discrepancies. For example, you create discrepancies in Mecca. Mecca is not a place that fits the narrative that is within the Quran, and you have to address the discrepancies. For example, you create stories explaining how life was possible in Mecca, and you rewrite the previous one. You destroy the earlier version of the stories, and in the end, you have a sort of vicious circle. The Islamic narrative functions by having inventions that create contradictions, inconsistencies, discrepancies, and there is a need for corrections, who leads to new inventions. And let me give you an example, a very famous one, a classic case. It's a case of the satanic verses. You know about it. They supposedly, in the Quran, there are verses that, according to the Islamic narrative, are not supposed to be there. Actually, they are not there. You find them in the Islamic tradition, which tells us that there was some satanic verses in the Quran. What happened exactly? There was a first invention. There was the Quran, and the invention was that Muhammad was the author of the Quran. There was a second invention, that the Quran is supposed to be the revelation, God's exact word. But it created a discrepancy. The discrepancy is that the text, the Quranic text, seems to praise pagan divinities. Originally, we know it from the Islamic tradition, there was this passage in verse 19 to 21 in Surah 53. Have you seen Allat, Al-Uzza, Al-Manat, the third, the other? There was this passage. These are the high-flying cranes, the high-flying deities. Verily, the intercession is hoped for. The discrepancy is that the original text of the Quran did not fit the new narrative, and it was supposed to be the revelation of a monotheistic God who was very, very keen on forbidding the worship of pagan deities. So they invented a correction. The correction is the invention of the story that Satan inspired Muhammad instead of God for these verses. But for this to be legit, a few more inventions were needed. For example, the verse 52, 54 in Surah 22 were reinterpreted as telling that the prophet can sometimes be inspired by Satan. The main invention we find in Tabari's Chronicle, where he explicitly writes that the prophet was inspired by Satan. And to address some of the oddness and something that isn't right within Islam, the fact that the prophet seems to praise pagan divinities. Many hadiths were invented where the prophet condemns the worship of Allat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat. I've seen maybe 8 or 9 hadiths where the prophet says, you cannot, you shouldn't, it is forbidden to worship Allat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat. And this way it was a sort of a correction. But by doing so, by inventing the story of Satan inspiring Muhammad, it created a new discrepancy. How is Muhammad and the whole Quran to be trusted if it can be inspired by Satan? And so they had to spin the circle once again. And in a story needed an invention, creates a discrepancy, which is correction, and a new invention, and so on. And so there was a new invention, a new action was taken, the Quran was redacted. And the red part you see in the verse, the part that cannot have been uttered by a monotheistic prophet, was taken out of the Quran. And the Quran was redacted, and nowadays, if you buy a Quran, you won't find the mention to the high-flying deities whose intercession is hoped for. And this is how the narrative was created. So you see, it's a very tedious process, a very lengthy process. And it created a very deeply flawed narrative. Because you see, at the heart of the process, there is an industrial discrepancy factory, a discrepancy factory on an industrial level, which explains why there are so many contradictions, dilemmas. We talked about dilemmas in our first day here at the NAPC, and there are also external discrepancies. But it was impossible to have a coherent and plausible narrative by doing this way. In the same way, In the same way, when someone lies and tells a story of lies that builds upon lies and lies and lies, it cannot hold in the end. It's too difficult to have coherence and plausibility. It's even more difficult that here you have to have coherence with history, geography, non-Muslim sources on which the Caliph had no control. And there were also countless numerous internal contradictions, incoherencies. And so this process kept on. The circle, the vicious circle, kept on spinning for centuries, creating the millions of pages of the Islamic narrative, of the Islamic tradition. And it had to stop, because Islam would have exploded otherwise, and it led to the petrification of Islam. You know, this series of decisions that were taken around the 10th and 11th century. For example, the Quran was declared uncreated. There was the doctrine of the abrogation and the closure of the ijtihad, of the interpretation. And so Islam was sort of stopped in its progress, in the development of its narrative. It left Muslim with a very flawed narrative that relies on circular logic, auto-reference for its own justification. And it forced to impose the Quran as being absolutely sacred, and the figure of Muhammad as being absolutely sacred. This is the explanation why Muhammad cannot be critiqued within Islam, because the stories about him are ludicrously and evidently false. And it's very easy to see that they are not right. When you have 8 scholars who have 8 different versions for the same event, supposedly in the life of Muhammad, you realize very quickly that everything is false, that the narrative is completely false. So you now understand how it was created, and you now understand the dire situation of Muslims. They are trapped in a false narrative that they cannot understand from within. If you are within the narrative, with its internal coherence, internal plausibility, in appearance, superficial coherence and plausibility, you cannot understand how it was created. You have to take it for granted that the scholars that created the narrative were actually historians doing an inquiry, an historical inquiry, and that you can maybe critique a bit if you are yourself a scholar, but globally, the story is good. You also came to realize, when you look at the history of Islam this way, that the narrative might seem important in Islam, but Islam existed before its narrative. The spiritual drive, the true spiritual force of Islam is actually independent of this narrative. The narrative served as a legitimation of it, but it came later to define it. And this will be an allusion to the workshop I did this morning, where I addressed the spiritual drive of Islam, which is something, this will be my conclusion, that is very important. You remember that when I described the early story of Islam, it was all about the end of times. People were waiting for the Messiah to come and to save the situation. Islam is about this, still about this. Even though there is no more waiting for a Messiah to imminently come, Islam is still about collective salvation. But instead of having the Messiah doing God's work, it's the Muslims that do God's work. It's the Muslims that establish God's kingdom on earth by force, by enforcing Sharia law. This is Islam, actually. Islam is about enforcing God's kingdom on earth by enforcing Sharia law. This is the true spiritual force that is hidden behind this enormous, gigantic narrative. I will stop there. Thank you a lot for your attention. You see? So I hope it was understandable, even with my poor English skills. But I'm ready to answer any question should anything needs more clarity. Ah, no, there is no time for question. I thought we had 5 minutes, but okay. But I'm still ready for your questions, but in the coffee room. Thank you a lot.